So lots going on, lots. First of all, the Tucker stuff, like this isn't going away. We keep learning new things. What's your gut feeling? Do you have a gut feeling? I mean, what the heck went on? How did they get rid of their number one star?
It's a fascinating story because you wonder if Fox News is getting to a point where they're risk averse, right? And that's a huge problem for conservatives in general. Fox has done such an incredible job at trying to maintain some sort of balance in this country, bringing to the country much needed perspective that is outside of the typical mainstream media bubble. And if Fox is changing in a way that they're getting scared of people saying things that are out of line with the mainstream narrative, that is a terrible development, not just for cable news, not just for conservatives, but for the entire country.
You think that's what it really came down to, fear?
I mean, this is going to be the $1 million question. In fact, much more than $1 million is that question here. It's a lot
almost $1 billion.
Yeah, it's going to be. I mean, and the fact is, of course, they're going into their negotiations for carriage fees with these cable providers and satellite providers now. And there's a question of whether that has something to do with this. There's, of course, the potential of, there. Look, I think
Fox. You might have hit might have hit the nail on the head. I mean, I'm talking out loud. I don't know. I have no inside information about how any of this went down, but I think that might be relevant. I mean, look, one of the reasons they wanted Tucker was because all the cable providers wanted him theoretically. I mean, I don't know if they really want him, but the viewers did, right? So even if advertisers were like, I'm not advertising on Tucker's show, it didn't really matter because you got good cable fees. And the cable companies would be like, yep, well, my viewers want Tucker. And if you don't have Tucker, like, what else do you got? That could have played a role for sure.
Yeah. And this is the vast majority of their business, right? Like, certainly advertising is a chunk, but really what fuels Fox News and especially multiple big cable companies, or cable channels, but Fox News is really like, number one or number two, not in cable news, but in all of cable television. So this is an incredible draw, and you're ripping off the guy who is driving the ratings on that network. I mean, it really is unprecedented in a lot of ways. We've seen other big high-profile hosts leave Fox News under varying circumstances. I was there with Glenn when he left on his own accord, I might add, even though everyone has reported that incorrectly, and they do it every time some host leaves. But still, it was one of those situations where, going back to what you said about Roger, I think you're right. Like, Roger had for all of his problems, had a real vision for what the network was and believed in it. And I think the hosts that were there realized that at times, as long as they kind of kept the company line and didn't criticize other hosts on the network and do things that were erratic in that way, they would have some sort of backing if their opinions were a little bit different.
Yes.
And look, Tucker, I agree with you. I agree with a lot of the stuff that Tucker says, not everything, but he was unique in his ability to be able to drive the news cycle and kind of just grab it by the collar and pull it over to where he wanted to be and create a conversation. And, I'm sure you're the same as me. I don't go to shows just to agree with the host. I want to hear different perspectives and I want to be challenged in what I believe. And Tucker was very good at that.
Very good at that. No, very, very gifted broadcaster in that sense, and really just had an ability, and still does, by the way. I think the guy is going to go on to do amazing things, great things. Yeah. And we live in a world now where creators can do that, and he'll have full ownership of it. So it could be a very exciting time for him as an entrepreneur. But what does Fox do? I mean, I've joked, like, we can compare them to Bud Light. They just got rid of their biggest star, and viewers are going to be angry. And we know what's happened before. I mean, they've always pulled through, but they got rid of Bill O'Reilly and people were like, oh, and then, Megyn Kelly left and there's been a lot of upheaval. And the question is, can they still attract viewers at 8 o'clock? Can you put a monkey in the seat basically and still get them because it's the platform itself?
Yeah, look, there's certainly a lot of strength in that platform. I do think that, Tucker, Bill O'Reilly, Megyn Kelly, and Glenn Beck, yourself as well, when you're there and you have a host that's really can draw in an audience and engage people, you hate to lose them. This is a difficult game to be playing. The Bud Light comparison's a really great one because, I think Bud Light kind of was seen as like untouchable, right? Every sporting event you go to, it's just there. You take it. It's never going to go down. I mean, it was never great beer. People didn't drink it for that reason. Yeah, exactly. It's watery, but it is available and relatively cheap, and people like getting drunk. So it was there. And it's funny because they did something that really shook their audience. Will this be the thing for Fox News to do that? I think, and in some ways, they panicked too much after their call in Arizona, and that really angered a lot of their viewers. And you can see the behind the scene texting of them really panicking about people going over to Newsmax. And while, of course, you want to be competitive, they should have probably recognized they still had Tucker Carlson there. They still had a lot of the top talent there. And they panicked in ways that probably wound up hurting them in the lawsuit and some of these other ways. The Tucker part of this is really interesting, too. When he's got that choice to make now where he can go, and if he wants to be an entrepreneur, and, he can make a lot of money. There's a lot to that. There's hiring sales staff and hiring IT people and all these other things. Or he's going to get.
Tell me about it.
Exactly, right?
No, I mean, it's not easy. You're like, wait a second. I know how to be on camera. I know how to write a good show. I know how to do an interview. And now I have to do all this.
Yeah.
I have to hire all these IT sales. Yeah, I gotcha.
Believe me, we left when we left Fox, we went to an environment in which no one knew how to stream video. I mean, this is before any of that happened. When you try to stream it, it would buffer every single time you tried to play a show. And Glenn, had to work to try it with his people here to try to make the infrastructure work. And, it was a lot. Yeah. Tucker's going to get a lot of money thrown at him by a lot of companies if he's a free agent. And, he might just say, look, I can keep my influence. I can have all the infrastructure built in. Let me collect a giant paycheck and do my show with no restrictions. And that's a pretty appealing process.
It's hard though. I mean, I think, and probably, you guys felt this way too. When I left, and it was not an ideal situation because it was sort of like, wait a second. Okay. We don't like what she said. And even though, by the way, management had they used to sign off on my commentaries every night, which I hated. And by the way, this is the freedom I have now. And nobody has to sign off on anything I do. I mean, the algorithms may shut me down. Hey, but at least I'm true to self. But anyway, they'd sign off on it. But in this particular case, they would not back me. Right. So like when the vultures came out and the media was all over, there was no one to help me. And I thought, why would I ever work for anyone that's not going to support me in what I'm saying and doing, especially when they're the ones that signed off and approved it. Like that, to me, it was such a kick in the stomach, really. And I wonder if Tucker, I'll have to talk to him sometime about it. I wonder if he felt the same way, because it's sort of like you're just gutted. You're like, wait a second, you guys were here. You guys, everything was fine. And then all of a sudden, it's too much and it's not. So that's tough. And so sure, to your point, he could go and work for somebody else, but simultaneously, there's a real sort of peace of mind, I think, in doing what you and Glenn have done, and to just kind of have ownership of something yourself. It's meaningful.
Yeah. And, the good thing is there is a conservative media ecosphere that's kind of available to people that was not available when we first left Fox. Yeah. There are companies that I think do have your back. I will say, like, we had some real dust ups early on in the Fox days. There were some real questions. Glenn got into a little bit of trouble here and there, as you may have heard. And when Roger was there, he typically would back Glenn, even in difficult times. It felt like you had a little bit of protection. I think your situation's a really interesting one in that you didn't say anything crazy. You didn't say anything wild. And I think there was a real change in Fox News. And I think you're seeing that even more now with Tucker. It's going the wrong direction. And if the media pounces, Roger would never let any of his troops go down, right? Because if they take one, they get the whole army. And I think he had that mentality, whereas now it's like, whoa, when things get rough, they'll just start feeding you to the wolves. I also had the negativity of being on opposite Tucker at 8:00, which, by the way, I didn't want and I didn't choose, but they somehow had the brilliant idea that they would put on another show to compete with the mothership, which obviously it was never going to compete with. We didn't have that kind of viewership. But even when you're getting a few 100,000 a night, and if he's neck and neck with Rachel Maddow, it's not ideal, right, from a business point of view. And I understand that and I get it. But look, I mean, it's a very different culture over there. What would your advice giving? And again, everyone, we're talking with Stu, who, by the way, your show, Stu Does America, every night, 8 p.m. They should check that out. They can watch on YouTube, on the Blaze. Yeah, please do. A podcast
All
is
those good
available as
places.
well.
And it's important right now. It's important because you guys are truth tellers and you've got great opinions. And I want to get to them in a second because that could be sort of under fire in this moment. But what's your advice to Tucker Carlson, given that you've been through this sort of startup environment? What would you and Glenn as well, like what would you guys say? Here's what you do.
Well, it's fascinating. Of course, we don't know the details of his contract and everything. He may have some restrictions, but look, I think he is at the position where he has a somewhat developed possibility to go to a company that can help him. I'm not making any formal offers, but Blaze TV would be one that he should consider. I think there's a lot out there where, it's different. You can have huge audiences. I know you have a huge audience. We have a lot of big shows here at Blaze TV where you can go directly to the people. It wasn't possible before this. You needed someone like Roger to kind of change things up. And now that's available to him. So if I were him, I would be looking at offers, signing a contract that gives me a gigantic check, and then feel completely free to speak your mind and have all the influence that you want. I mean, he really is in that position, and not many people get there.
Yeah, no, it's a very, I think it's sound advice. I think it's good advice. And I wouldn't be surprised if he takes that advice at one place or another. So he doesn't have to work on the IT and all that good stuff, but can just focus on the content, which he does really, really well. Let me ask you about the future of the media right now. You mentioned that Fox may be getting a little bit scared. We saw that basically 51 spies came together at the request of Antony Blinken, who got his friend Mike Morrell to round up 50 more, and put out a letter saying that the Hunter Biden laptop story was Russian disinformation. Keep in mind, it was sort of the same cast of characters that told us that there was some there with the Trump dossier. It turned out the Trump dossier, the dirty dossier, that was fake. And it turns out the Hunter Biden laptop was actually real. People got in like hot water for that, myself included. I mean, like Facebook was awful to me because we published one story on the Hunter Biden laptop. Do you worry that that's going to happen again?
Did you ever get your apology for that, by the way?
No, I never. I'm still waiting. They finally freed me up, by the way. Like I finally on all these platforms, but I'm like, okay, people subscribe now, hit the bell because I don't know how long this is going to go.
Yeah, I know it's really sad, and you wonder where this is going to go. And the scary part about this is the 51 people who are in this. They're signing this document saying that this is Russian disinformation at the behest of Antony Blinken. This doesn't lead to Antony Blinken being disgraced or shamed or tossed aside from any public role of influence. He's the Secretary of State. We've come to this place where people do things that are obviously wrong, obviously politically motivated, and now everyone knows, even the New York Times, that this was an obvious lie at the behest of the campaign, which was never disclosed at the time. And this guy gets to celebrate. This guy gets to have, one of the top 2 or 3 most influential jobs in the country and one of the most powerful people in the world, especially when you think of this, this particular administration where you have a president that can't really even speak. So you have a person like Antony Blinken who really has a massive influence as to what we're doing in the world right now. And, it makes you feel like there's almost no hope. I mean, I get there really quite often. It feels at times that everything is kind of hopeless. We do have to remember, of course, that it's, things have changed. There are ways to push back. I think this sort of secondary media, sort of a parallel media that has developed is really positive. And while we do get throttled by Facebook and we do get censored by all these institutions all the time, you've seen so many of these cases where that censorship occurred, where we've been able to turn around the American people to show that those viewpoints were correct, even with all those blockages in place. And I think that's a really positive way of looking at it. Capitalism has a lot of really positive features to it. And they can often, we've seen countries over and over again try to institute things like fascism and communism, and capitalism usually figures out a way to rise up and overcome them in the long term. It just,
because it doesn't work. It just doesn't work. Do you think, though, that we need more conservatives throughout? I mean, we talk about the media, and conservatives have sort of found their niche, if you would, in this sort of more splintered environment. But when you think about even Hollywood, and your colleague over there, Steve Deace, I was talking to him just the other day, that Nefarious movie. I mean, fantastic. It's doing really well, and sort of in spite of the fact that it had a conservative backing. do we need, as conservatives, as Americans, right, in terms of making sure that both sides are kind of out there represented, and we're not clamping down on a particular side of speech? Do we need more of that?
Yeah, I just want a fair battle. I really believe that conservative ideals will win. They're better. I think when given the opportunity, people typically choose them. Even people on the left,
It's like natural.
yeah, they can't help themselves. They can't help themselves being on Uber and having their iPhone, and they can't avoid capitalism even when they hate it. And I think that's a great thing. Capitalism always wins in the end. At least that's the way I'd like to believe.
That's for sure. We certainly don't want to be Venezuela. Hey, Stu, it's great to see you. Everybody should tune in tonight. Stu Does America. Check him out, 8 p.m. every single night, Monday through Friday. He'll be there. And I thank you for your time today.
Thanks so much. I appreciate it.